What a difference a few months can make. At the onset of 1793, the armies of the French Republic were poised to recreate their incredible successes from the previous year, to advance deeper into enemy territory, liberating subjected peoples, and repel the forces of the old order. But that, as we know, is not what happened. Instead, in only a few months, all those gains were rendered mute. At best, French forces were barely holding up a last-ditch defence, as was the case in Savoy and Germany. At worst, they had retreated, giving the enemy ample opportunity to re-invade. We covered in pretty good detail the military and strategic situation that faced the Republic, up until about April. I now want to go over the political situation in Paris. Like all capitals of nations at war, Paris was a flurry of activity. But not a nice kind of activity, with people going about their business and crowds gathered in public spaces. This was a kind of nervous, furtive activity. The squares were occupied by the out of work. Hospitals were overflowing with sick and wounded. Billowing smoke from manufactories churning up muskets, bullets and bayonets. Tailors were sewing together uniforms or stitching up the injured with their practiced hands. With so many off to war, non-essential services were forgotten about, or else picked up by women and invalids. Streets filled with debris, buildings fell into varying states of disrepair. And the war's appetite for fresh meat necessitated a constant stream of men and material. Patriotic enthusiasm that had combined with the revolutionary zeal to bring so many volunteers to the colours was now all but spent. The rigours and realities of war had made sure of that. Press gangs had to force guys to volunteer. Standards for recruitment were slackened. Old men, the sick, criminals offered a guillotine or a uniform. And over this city at war, a microcosm of the nation at war, presided the National Convention. The discord and acrimony between the Girondins and Jacobins had been largely put on hold, though not out of any sense of high-minded bipartisanship. The victory at Valmy had radically altered everyone's political calculus, especially for the Jacobins. For a while there, it looked like the doves were going to be proven right, that this war was a foolhardy endeavour. But riding the outpouring surge of enthusiasm after Valmy, the Girondins rose to incredible heights. As 1792 came to a close, their position seemed, like those of France's armies, to be unassailable. Nonetheless, the Jacobins could see the cracks in the foundation. Despite public displays of confidence in the troops and an unwavering commitment to the revolution, the Girondins were rapidly losing control of both the domestic and strategic situation. As mentioned last time, the convention faced perilous economic problems. More specifically, this was a crisis of inflation. As we know, the Ancien regime's raft of taxes had been abolished. Now in their place was a single tax on property. The convention, like its peers, had expected to make up the shortfall with patriotic contributions. These had, however, never proven sufficient. But the money coming in from the war had taken the edge off. When the war had been going well, feeding itself, captured loot and payments made by occupied peoples meant France had at least a decent stream of income. Combine this with the seizure of noble and church properties, and the convention did have some money, not nearly enough, mind, but certainly a profit. Without a strong tax base, though, this was not a permanent solution. But that didn't stop the convention from printing and spending assignats recklessly. The folly of this approach was made abundantly clear when defeat cut the purse strings. French armies no longer occupied foreign lands, instead struggling to hold on to their own, with France itself bearing all the expense. At the same time, the law of diminishing returns set in, and confiscated lands were no longer as numerous or as valuable. With expenses mounting and income drying up, the convention now faced the consequences of their over-budgeting: inflation. By February of 1793, the assignat was trading at a mere 36% of its initial value. The convention felt that the only way out was to print their way out. 1.2 million individual assignats had been printed from October to February, and the circulation ceiling raised to 350,000. This was devastating. Obviously, it wasn't great that the assignat was barely worth the paper it was printed on. No, the real problem was the Montagnards' insistence that the assignat remain the Republic's sole currency. Girondin attempts to restore the livre, a hard currency, was shot down in flames. This was perhaps a painful but necessary decision, as the convention had so little hard currency anyway, which almost exclusively went to paying for the army, as many troops, contractors and suppliers refused to accept paper money. This made the assignat the money of civilian life, and it couldn't get you much. Unscrupulous merchants ramped up their prices. Soap, for instance, was about triple its price from 1790, costing approximately 28 sous. With the purchasing power of the assignat slooping to a third of its initial value, things were pretty bad. Problems like this affected literally everything, from staple goods to rent, wages to bread prices. A starving Paris couldn't wait long, and demonstrations occurred right throughout February. Demonstrations, though, not riots. A particularly large demonstration occurred on the 25th and began in the poorest sections, but soon spread to encompass the entire city. The homes and stores of merchants were blockaded and taxation populaire imposed. Taxation populaire was simply what people deemed a fair price. Parisians were willing to pay about 40% of market value for their goods, no more. This was what happened when the convention failed to impose price controls. Some of the more radical Montagnards, like Saint-Just, were sympathetic to the plight, but the more numerous moderates, like Robespierre, weren't. Reports that the demonstration had focused on luxury goods, like sugar, tobacco and coffee, meant that Robespierre considered the entire demonstration to be a counter-revolutionary plot. Actually, it was on political grounds that the Montagnards objected to price controls. Under the Ancien regime, short-term price controls were instituted to alleviate bread shortages. In order to avoid associations with the monarchy, and more crucially, to protect the rights to free enterprise enjoyed by the merchants, the Montagnards refused to follow suit. For now at least, they believed that the free market would provide. On more reasonable economic grounds did the Girondins object, knowing that the merchants bore the costs because their wholesalers couldn't give any less of a shit and wouldn't drop their prices a jot. The convention was not, however, completely immovable. Where necessary, they seized grain stores and fixed the price of bread. Nearly 500,000 francs was spent subsidizing bread for the Paris poor. These myriad woes and issues reflected poorly on the Girondins' handling of the war. And yet, there was still optimism for the prospects in the new year. Once the ice and snow thawed and the campaign resumed, the armies of the Republic would carry forth the revolution, one liberated territory at a time. The Girondins' political fortunes were completely inseparable from the fortunes of war. A critical vulnerability, because then came Neerwinden. In March, an Austro-Dutch force counterattacked, defeating Dumouriez at Neerwinden. Now, the defeat itself might not have been fatal for the Girondins, but Dumouriez's betrayal also definitely was. The poster child for the Girondins had turned traitor, unilaterally parleying with the Austrians, and then afterwards attempting to march on Paris to decapitate the convention. It was the exact moment of weakness the Jacobins could take advantage of. As the Girondins scrambled for answers and the war took a dire turn, discord and discontent out in the departments evolved into a full-blown regional revolt against their national convention in Paris. Every township, city and village experienced severe upheaval. Pro-revolutionary and counter-revolutionary forces clashed frequently, often bloodily. Gangs roamed the streets, soldiers defected, banditry went unchecked, lynchings, executions and show trials were common occurrences. There were plenty of people out in the departments, especially in the south and in the west, who took severe objection to the September massacres. But what had pushed them over the edge, and indeed the event that triggered many of these regional revolts, was the execution of Louis. It seemed to them that all law and common sense had been thrown out the window in order to placate the passions of the sans-culottes. Reactionary aristocrats, refractory priests, and conservative bourgeoisie found ready allies in the rural peasantry, for whom the combined injustices of the civil constitution of the clergy and forced enlistment were the main sources of their hatred for the central government in Paris. Together, the forces of reaction and counter-revolution overthrew revolutionary town councils, massacred Republican officials or partisans, and even threw open their gates to the enemies of France. That's not to say that the counter-revolutionary forces had it easy. The revolutionary order resisted fiercely. Regional National Guard units fought back against the uprisings. Counter-revolutionary agitators were rounded up, tried and executed by local tribunals. Many of these fights were fought less over ideology, but as is so often the case, over old grudges or out of sheer ambition. Towns which were regional rivals might pick sides and square off. Familial rivalry spilled out into open conflict. Public officials were denounced from below by men ambitious for promotion. People all throughout the nation were forced to make choices. Difficult choices. Some might sacrifice their ideals to save their lives. Others might seek out danger or flee to safety. A pious Catholic had to decide whether or not it was worth risking their lives to receive communion for a newborn from a supposedly untainted refractory priest. Administrators and officials asked themselves, was it worth it to abandon their posts and thus their prospects? Fundamentally, what determined all of these millions of individual choices, to stay or to go, to collaborate or resist, to lead or follow, playing out against the backdrop of political violence, was rarely about outright support for the revolution. The real fundamental question was materialistic. What has the revolution done for me and mine? A local administrator with a cushy job and a member of the dominant political party, having risen from obscurity on the coattails of revolution, he was obviously likely to support that revolution. What about a practicing Jew, or a Protestant, or an ethnic or religious minority? Guaranteed rights by the revolution, their commitment was unwavering. But a refractory priest, a half-starved superstitious peasant, the orphan of an executed aristocrat, For those that couldn't survive in this new revolutionary order, when counter-revolution broke out, the choice was obvious. And these questions were distilled further by regional implications. If a region skewed one way, contrary to your own politics, it was far safer to simply play along. Everywhere, everyone struggled, or fought, or fled, making hard choices in hard times. And the hardest choices of all were being made out west, in the Loire Valley, a region called the Vendée. Counter-revolutionary sentiment, specifically anti-republican sentiment, had been on the rise here for a few years now, gradually displacing pro-revolutionary elements. Where the south of France was pretty 50-50, in the west, by 1793, the majority skewed counter-revolutionary. The divide was both political and regional. Self-described patriots, bourgeoisie and sans-culottes, dominated in the urban centres and obeyed the National Convention. Patriots were absolutely ascendant in the trading cities of Brittany. In La Rochelle, for instance, despite economic misfortune caused by a British blockade, the mostly Protestant merchants and businessmen backed the revolution to the hilt, supplying food, money and equipment for the war effort. Everywhere they were dominant, the patriots went so far as to emulate revolutionary laws in their own towns and cities. In particular, laws centering on the practice of religion. Patriots pushed hard for freedom of religion and for local priests to adhere to the civil constitution of the clergy. In protest, many had fled to Spain or Ireland. Yet more were to join them after 1792, when the patriots' pleas to Paris that harsh measures be taken were finally heeded. National Guards scoured the countryside to detain non-juring priests, many of whom evaded capture by seeking the protection of their pious followers. The effect was to strengthen ties between parishioner and priest, while wrecking that between the government and the people. As the revolutionary authorities lay into the clergy, urban workers were concerned with the usual trifecta of inflation, layoffs and expensive food. Hit hard by the blockade, they switched to support for the counter-revolution. And even middle-class intelligentsia, the backbone of the revolution, often lost out on administrative positions or elected offices. Or else they held genuinely strong beliefs and took a stand against the revolution. Young aristocratic army officers, namely in the western areas of Normandy, likewise turned against the Republic, their families having been displaced and their properties seized. Again, like everywhere else in France, for those in the Vendée, the question of support for the revolution was materialistic. Did it help me and mine? And for most, the answer was no. No, it did not. The treatment of priests and Catholics in general was another decisive factor. Refractory priests had long found succour in the region, welcomed by rural peasants opposed to anti-clericalism, while the juring priests who came in to replace them were spurned. Now this wasn't universal. Some villagers and peasants absolutely were pro-revolutionary, but pretty generally the rural peasantry trusted the traditional non-juring clergy. That being said, the priests weren't completely above board, and did leverage their spiritual authority to keep the peasants on side. Civic ceremonies, marriages, funerals, and the like were recent innovations made by the revolutionaries and entrusted to the juring priests. Non-juring priests explicitly condemned these civic services as illegitimate, and thus in defiance of God's will. A sense of both fear and love, therefore, kept the peasants loyal. This loyalty was reinforced by the regional ties of many of the priests. Most of the priests local to the Vendée were drawn from rural parishes. Urban parishes were almost all vacant by 1793. Even still, urban priests were still overwhelmingly non-juring. Something like 80% of the Vendée clergy refused to take the civic oath. Hints at the religious dimension to the violence were apparent as early as 1791, when local authorities had taken it upon themselves to detain refractory priests until they swore to the civic oath. Anti-clerical laws issued by the patriots threatened traditional Catholic ways of life and welcomed heretic religions out into the open. Such injustices could not be tolerated by the rural peasantry, goaded on by the refractory priests. Now all that I've described touches on the delicate balance maintained in the Vendée. Patriots had the cities, counter-revolutionaries had the countryside. This tentative balance had first been described to the National Convention by none other than Dumouriez when he was left in charge of military affairs in western France. He could see that the region was a powder keg. Hell, there were dozens of small-scale revolts throughout 1791 and 92 that prequeled what was to come. Only strong, immediate remedies might avert a civil war. But he had been ignored, and eventually left to take over the Army of the North. As he predicted, by 1793, the balance was breaking down. More and more urbanites turned their backs on the revolution, undermining the patriots in their own backyard. Even well-off minor landowners or rich ranchers threw in their lot with the rebels, hoping to get a fair share of available land. Adding to this was the constant influx of new counter-revolutionary priests and aristocrats, fleeing to one of the few safe regions left to them. Political violence was also rising precipitously. The whole region from Caen in Normandy to La Rochelle in Brittany was sparked into revolt by the promulgation of new recruitment laws in February and March of 1793. By order of Lazare Carnot, an army of 300,000 volunteers was to be raised, and the Vendée was expected to pull its weight. Following shortly after on March 6th was an order that all churches run by non-juring priests were to be shuttered. This immediately triggered across the Vendée the rising of peasant armies numbering into the tens of thousands. Led by disgruntled local leaders, old guard royalists, and boosted by refractory priests, they sought out those associated with the Republic. In the town of Machecoul, the rebels started the revolt as they meant to continue, swords drenched in blood. National Guard buckled under the pressure from tens of thousands of peasants who fled into the town once the church bells were rung. An army officer attempted to restore order, but was run through with a pike as 40 of the guards were killed, the rest imprisoned. They were later led out into the fields, tied to each other until they looked like a Catholic rosary. After digging ditches, they were all shot dead. It made the bloodshed back in town look quaint. A priest who had sworn the civic oath was dragged onto the street and his face mutilated with a bayonet until he was eventually put to death. Homes and offices belonging to patriots were raided. A guard officer jumped from a second-story window rather than be captured, breaking his leg in the process. He was then refused any help and left to die in agony. Machecoul was not unique. Regional National Guard were completely outnumbered, and after bloody, one-sided clashes, retreated to the relative safety of the port cities. The cities themselves organised hasty defences. La Rochelle sent 2,000 volunteers out to quash the revolt, but they were beaten soundly. Regular troops, desperately needed for the war effort, had to be diverted to suppress the revolt. But the initial fights between regular forces and the peasants demonstrated that this was something wholly different. The scale, the intensity, the severity of the uprising dwarfed anything that had come before. In the Vendée, the counter-revolution had taken implacable root, and the extreme lengths to which the convention would have to go in order to crush this rebellion amount to nothing less than civil war. By now, the National Convention, having vacated the Salle de Ménage and relocated to the Theatre of the Tuileries, a much larger venue, were already forced to institute emergency measures to save the Republic. The combination of myriad military failures, and the suspicion that they were a product of a deliberate conspiracy perpetrated by secretly disloyal senior officers, prompted a new course of action from the National Convention. If they would have any hope of dealing with these and other crises, it was the near-unanimous opinion of the National Convention that they had to centralise state power. Moreover, emergency laws would be required to untap the nation's potential. In the most immediate term, new recruits were desperately needed, and this was the reason for the new recruitment laws that triggered the explosion of violence in the Vendée. So pressing was the need for food, men, uniforms, guns, horses, and so on, that the convention instituted the levée en masse, about which I'll go into detail later on. Suffice to say, every resource and all the productive capacity in France, the entire economy really, was reoriented to supply and sustain the war effort. None of this was particularly popular, but the recruitment laws were particularly despised. All across the nation, more counter-revolutionary revolts erupted in defiance of the levée en masse. To counter these revolts, by decree of the National Convention, civil liberties were suspended. Captured rebels and counter-revolutionaries were almost invariably executed after perfunctory show trials. The purview of the Committee of Surveillance was expanded, and sister committees were established across the nation. They closely monitored suspected counter-revolutionaries, namely refractory priests and returned émigrés. If a priest was denounced by 6 citizens, then they were to be deported, though most ended up languishing in jail. Foreigners also became prime targets for authorities. Ordinances were issued either expelling these poor unfortunates or forcing them into house arrest. Émigrés who had returned to France under one of Louis's pardons faced extreme discrimination. Their civil rights were suspended, and most ended up dead. Former nobles or monarchists were likewise persecuted, picked up in police sweeps, often to be promptly tried and guillotined. Two big problems the convention faced were worries about the loyalty of the army and difficulty in getting disquiet departmental authorities to heed demands from a faraway self-styled sovereign body. To kill 2 birds with 1 stone, the convention resurrected the office of intendant on March 6th. 80 deputies were dispersed across the nation to oversee the army, streamline administration, and report their findings back to the convention. They would in short order be known as the representatives on mission. Unbeholden to both civilian and military authorities, the representatives had a direct line back to the convention. What they demanded and what they expected pretty generally happened. It took a very brave individual to challenge this authority. Nonetheless, the representatives were effective. Under their watch, graft would all but disappear, the politically unreliable were jettisoned, and the convention's decrees followed to the letter. Particular emphasis was placed on the influence exerted by the representatives embedded within the army. Several might be attached to a single general, and they were the eyes and ears of the convention. More than a few generals would lose their heads on the recommendations of the representatives. Such meddling was resented and definitely impaired the judgments of some generals. Later on, for instance in the siege of Toulon, the general in charge will basically sit back and let the representatives lead the siege, not wanting to risk the political fallout of defying them. Worth noting is that many of our revolutionaries will serve as representatives on mission, chopping and changing, going here and there as the need arose. Many of these emergency measures were popular, but most weren't. Generally, it was the Montagnards, backed by the Plain, who pushed through these unpopular laws. The Montagnards were all in for centralized power, and were willing to fight for it. The Plain saw the virtues in this approach. Let the Montagnards lead, and the Girondins take the heat. So from April into May, the comfortable majority the Girondins had enjoyed in relative alignment with the Plain rapidly shrank. This gave the Montagnards space to push through hardline economic reforms which would be emulated all throughout France by regional assemblies and local revolutionary councils. Most of these reforms focused on nationalizing key state resources and making essential goods affordable for the people. Prices on bread, wheat and corn in Paris were fixed, and the supply and distribution of these goods made the purview of the National Guard, not unscrupulous grain merchants. The Montagnards' shift away from market capitalism to state interventionism signaled two things. Number one, that the pressure exerted from below by the sans-culottes was becoming irresistible. They were, after all, the sword of Damocles hanging over the convention's head. Another great journée was likely if the people faced a stark choice between obedience or starvation. Number two, that the Montagnards' priorities were shifting, the result of exigencies imposed by a losing war and a shift into populism. As previously stated, Robespierre wanted market forces of supply and demand to dictate the convention's policy towards food. His moderate views were made public in a Declaration on Sustenance from December of 1792, in which he declared that the right to sustenance existed, but the convention's job was only to intervene in cases of extreme peril, not as a matter of course. But the threat posed by pissed-off Parisians, as well as the moral imperative to help fellow citizens, were sentiments expressed by the more radical Jacobins, generally younger and more populist. Robespierre's own protégé Saint-Just was one such voice of dissent, but he fell in line when the moderates spoke. Now, however, as grain shortages were so severe as to potentially topple the convention, Robespierre demonstrated his potent mix of pragmatic idealism and made a very worthwhile reorientation. From this day on, he would back interventionism to the hilt. Over the course of a few votes, the Montagnards completely abandoned market capitalism. They were now interventionists, invariably opting for the nationalization of vital war materials and state control for essential goods. This pragmatic shift was to prove decisive, as we'll find out later on. By contrast, the Girondins took a decidedly laissez-faire approach to questions of trade and economic policy. Even with a war to win, they were content to let the market self-regulate, a dubious approach even in the best of times, and these were not the best of times. What this meant was that sellers sold their foodstuffs for inflated prices to the desperate poor, and they had no choice but to cough up whatever sum was demanded. The rich could afford more, and so bought more, hoarding up most and leaving little for the truly needy. They also did nothing to redress the balance of land ownership out in the departments. As properties had been confiscated or abandoned, rich city dwellers had bought up the land with no concern as to how this might affect the local peasantry. Fertile farmland could be left unkempt, while peasants toiled away on inadequate acreages, barely scraping by. A more equitable distribution of tillable land was a central complaint made by rural peasants. Quite a few revolts would have ended had the convention simply let peasants redistribute unused land. Worth noting here is that the Montagnards and Girondins agreed. They couldn't stomach the thought of private property rights being undermined in any way. Still, the Girondins were the main problem, and let war profiteering and economic inequality fester to become major problems. This left it up to the Montagnards to be the ones to intervene and regulate the wartime economy. That being said, this was quite good for the Montagnards' popularity. Interventionism was very much a reflection of public opinion. Tighter controls and fixed prices were music to the ears of the sans-culottes, and these efforts did not go unrewarded. Jacobins gained a significant boost in popular support as the Girondins hemorrhaged supporters by the thousands. But while they were losing power, they were far from powerless, and the Girondins lashed out at the Plain and the Montagnards like a cornered cat. With such infighting within the convention, spelling the end of the post-Vimy truce, their overall efforts were severely undermined. Despite outward displays of confidence and unity, the cohesion of the revolutionary movement was imperiled by conflict between all revolutionary factions. And these conflicts would have far-reaching consequences. Obviously, there was the principal battle line drawn between revolutionaries, support for the Montagnards or support for the Girondins. This fight we're all well aware of. But more decisive was the influence of nominally independent political clubs. Take, for example, the Popular Society in the town of Bergerac. They tended to support the Girondins, but would later completely about-face in June to full-blooded support for the Jacobins. Other clubs, especially the further away you got from Paris, took a decidedly regional approach. Neither the cautious constitutionalism of the Girondins or the radical republicanism of the Jacobins truly benefited them. Instead, these clubs advocated disentanglement from Paris. Initially, they were happy with administrative independence, but later on down the line, this emergent federalist movement had many advocating for outright political independence from Paris. Another major fracture was opening up in the capital between the National Convention and the Sans-Culottes. Any number of policies and laws were huge disappointments to the Sans-Culottes. They lamented the Girondins in particular. Overly cautious, wary of ceding any political ground to the Montagnards, and deeply troubled by the rising radicalism of the Sans-Culottes, the Girondins tampered with the final form of enough laws to render many of the Convention's ordinances impotent. The Montagnards' full measures became the Girondins' half measures, and this did not do any favours for the Girondins' abysmal reputation. All of the dissatisfaction the Sans-Culottes felt about the Girondins were further exacerbated by the impassioned invectives of a new breed of politicised Parisian, the enragés. The term enragé, meaning the enraged, initially referred to a collection of individual leaders and ideologues who had risen to preeminence among the Sans-Culottes. It'd be accurate to call the enragés the spokespeople for the Sans-Culottes, firebrands best described as hyper-radical. Infamous enragés included Jacques Roux, Jean-François Vallée, and Claire Lacombe. As their bases of support solidified, and their personal politics were institutionalized and disseminated out into the body politique, a coherent political ideology crystallized. Much of this ideology was extremely revolutionary, even this late into the revolution. They were very pro-democratic, anti-authoritarian, and anti-capitalist. This anti-capitalist bit is probably the most interesting part of their platform. Since the Girondin Ministry of 1792 and the policies of Jean Roland during his tenure as the Minister of the Interior, the Republic had largely preserved the pro-business policies of the constitutional order. Remember, middle-class business owners and traders were a major source of voters and supporters for both the Jacobins and the Girondins, more so the Girondins, who wore their capitalist credentials proudly. As far as the enragés saw it, one authoritarian regime had been traded for another. Instead of the tyranny of the nobility, the people now languished under the tyranny of the bourgeoisie. And they had a point. Lands confiscated by the state, or vacated by fleeing aristocrats, were gobbled up by newly empowered bourgeoisie who had zero qualms about working the peasants as hard as ever. Reports flooded in from across France, telling of petty despots and absentee landlords. One such report read, "Hoarders of wheat in the farmers are at present to be feared more than despotism. They are to be feared more than the cruelest aristocracy." Stern measures were required to eradicate tyranny of any type. Naturally, these Girondins were not on board, and refused to be brought to task. They regularly took repressive measures against the enragés. Even the Jacobins were wary of the enragés, and had the Committee of Surveillance suppress their activities, albeit with a deliberately mild touch. That being said, the Jacobins were wary for a different reason. Jacobins knew better than most that the populism of the enragés made them susceptible to the vagaries of public opinion, a public that was prone to conspiracy theories and egged on by the radical press. Thus, the measures the enragés proposed to deal with issues of wealth inequality or political redress were not the legalistic, situational solutions the Jacobin preferred. The enragés were all in for execution without trial, violent reprisal, and the forcible seizure of property. For instance, on February 11th, they proposed a 6-year prison sentence for grain speculators. And if they were found guilty a second time, it was to be the guillotine. Until March of 1793, the enragés were content to rail against the Convention, but that was about all they could do. They weren't aided by the fact that many leading enragés, like Jacques Vallée, were personally quite wealthy. Moreover, whilst their populist rhetorical appeals were fully fleshed out, the enragés lacked a sizable following that was willing to do more than listen. This relative impotence was revealed in March, when Vallée produced a list of 22 Girondins he demanded be arrested for having voted for clemency for Citizen Capet. He followed this up with a list of political prisoners to be freed after they'd been imprisoned during February's grain demonstrations. To back these demands, Vallée and other enragés organised a pretty pathetic journée for March 10th. Nothing much came of it. There weren't enough people to actually force the issue, so the enragés resorted to a bit of vandalism, invading the printing presses of 2 major Girondin publications. They did get something out of it. Brissot's own Patriote Français was put out of commission for a few days, and the political prisoners were released. This was not a significant victory, but did at least demonstrate to the Sans-Culottes and the sections that the enragés weren't just talk. By the end of March, many Sans-Culottes promised support for future journées. Pretty soon, several of the most radical sections declared in favour of the enragés. The insurrectionary commune wasn't best pleased that they had a potential rival for the affections of the people, but cleverly chose to harness the enragés, not, enrage them. This was a good move. the enragés were elevated and the Commune reclaimed control of the Sans-Culottes, in something amounting to a de facto populist alliance. An emboldened arraignment of enragés immediately went on the rhetorical offensive. All the arrests made by the Committee of Surveillance had once again filled up the prisons. Last time that had happened, last September, well, it hadn't gone well for the prisoners. No surprise, but the enragés didn't want the convention to show any mercy. All the counter-revolutionaries had to die. And if the convention wouldn't comply, said the enragés, maybe the people would have to take matters into their own hands once again. Girondins had been able to resist these demands for some time now, but Dumouriez's betrayal changed everything. Ever since the trial of Citizen Capet, the Girondins had been on the popular shit list. Not only were the people aghast at their pathetic attempts to subvert the convention with their fatuous appeal to the nation, but also by the Girondins' association with Dumouriez. The numerous defeats and debacles were, in the minds of the enragés, all part of a plan by the Girondins to undermine the war effort. But to what end? While nobody has accused the enragés of being deep thinkers, their goal was to rile up the people. Dumouriez was a perfect target, a former aristocrat, a traitor, a failure, a Girondin. The betrayal of this avowed Girondin, combined with the instability wrought by regional revolts and a losing war, was the final back-breaking blow for the Girondins. Still, they refused to budge. So the enragés turned their attentions to the Jacobins. If the Girondins were unwilling to do what was deemed necessary for the survival of the revolution, perhaps the Jacobins might. After all, many Jacobins had been active participants in the September massacres. There was precedent. Georges Danton was caught right in the middle of this crossfire too, because quite regrettably for his fellow Jacobins, Danton had not only been a close friend of Dumouriez, but also quick to compromise and accommodate the Girondins. Now he faced a dilemma. Danton could either change his tune entirely and denounce the Girondins and Dumouriez with the zeal for which he was famed, or he could stick to his guns and try to walk the tightrope, keeping the convention free from the influence of the enragés. It'd be quite easy for his opponents, and he had plenty, to paint him with the same brush they'd painted the Girondins, as in league with counter-revolutionaries. But Danton was confident, both in himself and in the goodwill of his supporters. Instead of rejecting Dumouriez, he actually publicly defended the general. The imagery of a Montagnard protecting a Girondin made for potent symbolism, and allowed Danton to make an effective case for Montagnard-Girondin cooperation. Ever the negotiator, in speeches to the convention, he made it clear that they could ill afford to fight each other. Not only would it hamper the war effort, but it might invite the enragés to take advantage of a disunited convention. And he had a plan for how to handle the enragés. It was their belief that traitors to the revolution ought to be punished, killed outright. Multiple examples had shown that the enragés were willing to do this killing themselves. The power of life and death over a citizen had to be returned to the convention. To that end, he proposed on March 10th to resurrect an institution from the previous year, the Revolutionary Tribunal. Last time we saw the tribunal, they were trying and executing royal guards captured during the sack of the Tuileries. While their work finished, the tribunal was quickly dissolved, before the September massacres occurred. Danton wanted it reinstated to basically deal with the imprisoned counter-revolutionaries the convention's way, because the alternative was leaving them to the mercy of an unpredictable mob. Now many delegates were alarmed by this proposal, including Girondin Pierre Verginaud. He likened the tribunal to the Spanish Inquisition. Similarly dismayed, moderates interrupted Danton's speech with the shout Septembre, harkening back to the massacres. This really pissed off Danton, who thought that the tribunal was the only thing that could possibly prevent a repeat of the September massacres. In response to this chide, this is what he said. Since someone has recalled those bloody days, I say that if a revolutionary tribunal had then existed, the people who have been so cruelly reproached for them would not have stained them with blood. Let us do what the Legislative Assembly failed to do. Let us be terrible so that we may prevent the people from being terrible, so that the sword of the law weighs over the heads of all its enemies, and so that all will be avenged. Political objections to the Montagnards' proposal aside, the Girondins weren't in any position to refuse Danton. Many joined the Montagnard and the Plain to vote in favour. The Revolutionary Tribunal was up and running the very next day. Little did they know, but many Girondins had effectively signed their own death warrants. About a month later, in April, the situation looked pretty bleak for the young Republic. Further military reversals in the northeast, and pretty soon only the fortress at Valenciennes was standing between Paris and a looming Austrian army. The 25-man Committee of General Defense, entrusted with coordinating the convention's various committees and subcommittees, was simply overwhelmed by the task. In keeping with the theme of centralization, the committee was disbanded, and member of the Plain Maximin Isnard proposed a small 9-man committee take its place. It was to be called the Committee of Public Safety. Reception to the idea was initially quite hostile. Verginaud and other Girondins thought it reeked of Inquisition. Robespierre and the Montagnards thought that replacing one committee with another wouldn't really solve anything. A smaller committee was formed to hash out the details. They returned shortly and presented a plan to everyone's liking. Robespierre couldn't shake his misgivings, but most of the rest of the Montagnards were all in once they heard that Danton and 5 other Montagnards would be joined by 3 members of the Plain. The Montagnards would control this new Committee of Public Safety. And that's all it was for now. A body formed in response to a crisis, to literally manage the public safety. Still, it was Danton in charge, so it wasn't long before the committee adopted a very partisan, pro-Montagnard line. It turns out that the formation of the Revolutionary Tribunal hadn't really dampened the Enragés' passions. Now though, their invectives and tirades were trained on the detested Girondins. Public pressure brought to bear on the Montagnards was extreme, and did not merely call for them to denounce the Girondins, but rather to destroy them. And it was to be the Committee of Public Safety and the Revolutionary Tribunal which were to prove the vectors for the Girondins' final, belated demise. So Danton, bowing to irresistible public pressure, used his spot in the Committee of Public Safety to launch an investigation into the Girondins. The intention was to dig up dirt on some of the Girondins, perhaps something that might fatally discredit them. The main focus of these efforts was former Minister of the Interior Jean Roland, architect of the Girondins' unpopular economic policies. And though much rested on implicating Roland in something, anything really, it was all for naught. The minister's record was squeaky clean. In the minds of the people, however, this didn't prove anything. Just because nothing was amiss didn't prove nothing was going on. The Girondins had to have been conspiring with the Austrians, or Dumouriez, or someone. Realistically, the only genuine charge that could be pinned to the Girondins was their continued meddling and electioneering out in the departments, done in order to weaken regional Jacobin clubs. But this lack of evidence was not a problem for long, because Camille Desmoulins stepped forth. He produced a political pamphlet called The History of the Brissotins, Brissotins just being another somewhat derisive name for Brissot's Girondins. The pamphlet was absolutely scathing, and viciously derided the personal character of Brissot. In addition, the piece posited concocted charges of counter-revolution, for which the Girondins were solely responsible. The only recourse, claimed Desmoulins, was to arrest the Girondin leadership and oust the rest from both the convention and all government institutions. Now the Girondins didn't take this lying down. Instead, they took their own swings at Desmoulins, but without fail these desperate efforts did more harm than good. Danton thought that the Girondins were sowing the seeds of their own destruction by resisting. It was all but inevitable that they were politically doomed, so why did they tempt fate by pissing off the people? So again, Danton came to the rescue. He hoped to rehabilitate the Girondins. They were, after all, cut from the same legal and bourgeois cloth as he and the rest of the Montagnards. But regardless of how awful things had become, Brissot wasn't about to make peace with the Jacobins, under any circumstances. Our old friend Marguerite-Élie Godet, speaking on behalf of his fellow Girondins, categorically rejected Danton's olive branch. Convinced that the Jacobins were in league with the Enragés, and that Danton was responsible for the September massacres, he simply said, "Let there be war." And war it would be. The gloves now came off. Danton was done with half measures or attempts at compromise with the Girondins. This new about-face was evident immediately. At a convention session in which Dumouriez's betrayal was once again used to tar and feather both the Girondins and Danton, the fiery revolutionary interrupted proceedings and launched into an impassioned, vicious denunciation of the Girondins. The intensity of the speech was matched only by the venom behind each and every incisive insult. And like all of Danton's speeches, it built to a triumphant, climactic crescendo. I am now convinced that no truce is possible between the Montagnards, the patriots who wanted the king's death, and these cowards who slandered us in the hope of saving him. No more terms with them. I have returned to the fortress of reason. I will have it armed with the artillery of truth in order to blow all these enemies to dust. Utterly despised out in the departments, undermined by the Enragés and the Sans-Culottes, and now beyond reproach with the Montagnards, the Girondins' days in power were numbered. And yet, stubbornly, recklessly, against all common sense, did the Girondins hold out. Their response to Danton's tirade, and the Jacobins generally, was to take a stab at several of their members. The Revolutionary Tribunal was still largely controlled by the Girondins, so they had a bunch of their enemies arrested. This included popular propagandist Jean-Paul Marat, along with a bunch of other Jacobins, aligned moderates, and a few former aristocrats. One by one, those arrested were to be tried, and ideally, guillotined. It would have been an absolute coup if the Girondins could get rid of Marat. Of all the propagandists, Marat was the most persistent thorn in their side, and what's more, he'd recently been elected president of the Jacobin Club. It would be a doubly damaging blow to the Montagnards. But these hopes ran aground against reality. Whilst the Girondins held sway in the tribunal, Marat was still supremely popular, absolutely beloved by the Sans-Culottes and the Enragés, one of their own as far as they were concerned. And really, even though the neurotic and impersonable Marat was not well liked by his fellow Jacobins, they weren't really going to let him go to the guillotine. It seems likely that the Girondins knew this stunt would backfire, and backfire it did. To nobody's surprise, Marat was acquitted of bogus charges on day one of his trial. In celebration, the crowds of Sans-Culottes who had monitored the proceedings picked up Marat and paraded him along the streets. Given a laurel wreath to wear and applauded everywhere he went, it must have been very vindicating for the otherwise very introverted propagandiste to find that his position was unassailable. After zipping about for a while, the crowd, with Marat still held aloft, made haste for the Tuileries Theatre, where the convention was still in session. An advanced guard was sent to ask permission to present Marat to the convention. The current Girondin president, Aurel de Seychelles, wasn't best pleased, but insisted through gritted teeth that he would call for a vote to decide. But by now the Sans-Culottes were up in the stands and echoing the shouts of their brethren outside. And before anyone could stop them, dozens rushed into the theatre, Marat front and centre. One Sans-Culot, speaking for the rest, claimed that if worthy Marat's head must fall, ours will fall first. The convention wasn't terribly impressed by all of this. Even the Jacobins were a bit iffy about this whole thing. Some tried to leave but found the doors blocked. Others knew better and stayed put, hoping to wait things out. Marat was deposited on the left-hand side of the theatre in his rightful place among the Montagnards. He was then, shall we say, invited to address the convention. Speaking was not Marat's strong suit, but all in all he acquitted himself well. The speech was completely self-serving though, and he made sure to name names and point the finger. Speech over, Marat was picked up and escorted to the Jacobin Club. Undeterred and properly peeved by their failure, the Girondins shifted away from attacks on the Jacobins and instead resorted to undermining their old enemy, the Paris Commune. When in August of the previous year the insurrectionary Commune had been established by the Cordeliers Assembly, it had transitioned seamlessly into municipal government. And every day from then until now, the Commune had been an immovable obstacle for the Girondins. To rid themselves of the Commune once and for all, the Girondins pincered them from two sides. To begin, they ginned up the convention's fears about another brewing insurrection from the Paris Commune, and used this worry to form the Commission of 12. Now, on paper, the job of the Commission was meant to investigate the Commune's supposed plots and report back to the convention. But it wasn't long before the Commission's true colours were revealed. Most of the commissioners were Girondin, and having learned exactly nothing from their failure to try Marat, they ordered the illegal arrest of several of the Commune's leaders on May 25th. Those picked up in this sweep included Jean-François Vallet, a few of the Commune's leaders, and most crucially of all, Jacques Hébert. Hébert was the real target of these arrests. With his immense popular support and a self-made propaganda network at his beck and call, Hébert had proven to be one of the Girondins' most dangerous detractors. Eliminating him would not just silence a critic, but also hurt the Commune, as Hébert was their procurator. Obviously, the Commune didn't take the arrests of their own very well. Those Enragés and Commune leaders that remained rallied the people in mass demonstrations and made explicit threats to the Girondins. None of this stopped the Revolutionary Tribunal from beginning the trials, nor did it stop the Commission from making yet more arrests. Was the Paris Commune planning a coup prior to the arrest of Marat, Hébert and several other leaders? The answer is yes. Not sure exactly when, but certainly by April, the 35 sections of Paris had agreed to form a central revolutionary council to plan a coming coup against the Girondins. The arrests, therefore, instead of decapitating the Commune, brought their plans forward. They triggered the very coup which the Girondins feared was coming. Indeed, it was the actions of the Commission which had demonstrated to the Commune, the sections, the Sans-Culottes and the Enragés that the Girondins were out of order. They were willing to forego the law if it meant destroying their rivals. And what's more, with the Commission of 12 under their control, they had the capacity to do even more damage. They had to be stopped. Reluctantly, many Montagnards agreed. Not all by any means, but a decent chunk. By heavy-handed repression, Robespierre was convinced that they had brought this upon themselves. Danton was right there with the Commune in wanting to crush the Girondins. And for the rest who concurred, they did so from a mixture of resignation or a sense of self-preservation. Some, like Danton, went further still, offering more than mere tacit support. He was an active collaborator in the planning and organisation of the coup. But the initial idea of staging another journée was the idea of revolutionary women such as Claire Lacombe, Rosalie Julien, as well as the still very radical market women. The date for the journée was set for the 27th, 2 days after Hébert's arrest, and yet more proof of just how well organised the Commune was. Even with much of their leadership in chains, and languishing under active suppression and arrest from the Commission of 12, the Commune managed to muster all of Paris to their defence. This was the handiwork of a heavily streamlined and disciplined organization. For months, delegations from the most radical sections, such as the Coinville, had convened in the Archbishop of Paris's former palace, adjacent to Notre Dame. Both regular meetings and thorough planning laid the groundwork for mobilization. So on the day of the Journée, all the forces and institutions of popular revolution had turned out, arrayed against the Girondins. The sections were up in arms. Thousands of sans-culottes were out and about. Leon Roger's extolled the people and the Republic. Many Jacobins were either organizing behind the scenes or getting out of the damn way. Out of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, Les Halles, and the Cour des Miracles, strongholds of the sections, surged the sans-culottes, their predetermined paths converging on the Tuileries Theatre. Finding no resistance, the crowd flooded into the hall, halting the convention in the midst of their day's debates. Appointed spokespeople stepped forward, and not letting the Girondins mount any defense, they demanded the immediate and unconditional release of all those arrested, namely Hébert and Varlet. Now, the Girondins might have wanted to call for a vote on the issue, but they had better sense than to test their luck with armed revolutionaries literally here with them in the hall. In no position to refuse, the Girondins acquiesced to these demands. But the sans-culottes weren't quite done yet. Their other demand was for the Commission of 12 to be disbanded permanently. Again, seeing no alternative, the Girondins caved. And with that, the sans-culottes departed, absolutely convinced that they had won the first battle in the war to destroy the Girondins. Things weren't so cut and dry though. Once the interlopers had left, the Girondins basically looked around and said, "Are they gone? Good, they're gone. Let's just pretend that didn't happen." So even though the prisoners were freed as agreed, the commission was only disbanded for, maybe a few hours. The next day, May 28th, the commission carried on as though nothing had changed. With their leaders returned, and furious that the Girondins had backtracked on their word, the Commune wasted no time in launching a second journée. And I do mean no time. Pretty much the minute they were back, Varlet, Hébert and the rest declared the formation of a new insurrectionary commune. They then penned a petition which demanded the immediate freedom of all incarcerated political prisoners. It also included the list, the one written by the Enragés back in March and then expanded by the Central Revolutionary Committee back in April, containing the names of dozens of leading Girondins that were to be arrested once the coup occurred. To drive these demands home, the petition would be backed up by force. Not only did the Commune raise their militia of 20 to 30,000 sans-culottes, they also called upon the National Guard to aid them. François Hanriot, as hardcore revolutionary as you're likely to find, and a veteran of the August Journée, was the recently instated captain of the National Guard, and he didn't have any doubts about whose side he was on. Word of the insurrectionary commune's intentions were made known to the convention on the evening of the 28th. Just what to do and how to respond dominated their proceedings for the next day. Girondins, obviously, categorically refused to offer up their leaders or dissolve their commission. Many Jacobins were also reluctant to concede, fearing, correctly, that it would once again prove that the threats of mob violence could force political change, or even that this might bring down the whole Republican government. There was still a war to win after all. Could France really survive a coup in a time of acute national crisis? Clock ticking and debates raging, the Girondins still stubbornly refused to go quietly. But with Hanriot's guard blockading the Tuileries Theatre and the sans-culottes menacing Girondin delegates, the pressure to make a determination grew irresistible. There was only a single faint glimmer of hope for the Girondins. They put their trust in the Committee of Public Safety. On May 31st, when the petition was finally delivered to the convention, the Girondins agreed to dissolve the Commission of 12, but insisted that they could not vote on whether or not their leaders were to be arrested. That was a matter for the Committee of Public Safety to decide. This final, desperate gamble was doomed from the start. Their sworn enemy Danton was the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, and let's not forget, he was at war with the Girondins. They really shouldn't have pissed him off. Danton had the Girondins right where he wanted them, completely at his mercy. Even still, he wasn't the one to deliver the Girondins their coup de grace. Instead, their death blow would be delayed for a few days, not by Danton or anybody's political decision, but rather because everyone was busy, no one could spare the time to do it. The insurrectionary commune tried to organise a journée for the 31st to force the issue, but attendance was laughably low. Hundreds rocked up, not the expected tens of thousands. It was a Friday, a working day, and in lean times few could skimp on a day's wages. So the commune kept the candle lit for Saturday, having many Enragés give speeches to the crowds amassed in the Place de Grève, right outside the commune's headquarters in the Hôtel de Ville. Marat himself rang the tocsin bell above the hotel's large tower. Feeling like the people were now sufficiently fired up, but perhaps more importantly, present in sufficient numbers, the commune recommitted to a journée for the following day, Sunday, June 2nd. So this was it. Things had finally come to a head.
Bursting into the hall on Sunday morning, a small delegation from the insurrectionary commune reiterated the demands laid out in their petition and then departed. A ranking Girondin, Jean-Denis Langevin, rose to the defense of his colleagues. It was a brave stance to take. Catcalling from the stands gave way to credible threats of violence if Langevin didn't shut up. But he did not. Instead, Langevin chastised the Jacobins for having let an insurrection take place on their watch. Their heckling ineffective, a few Jacobins tried to overpower Langevin and force him to yield the floor. Clinging to the podium, he just wouldn't budge. So between the manhandling of the Jacobins and over the protest of the spectators, Langevin called for the Montagnards to rectify their mistake, and right now, then and there, join the Girondins in dissolving the insurrectionary commune. Quite rightly, the Jacobins pointed out that this was a ludicrous idea. The enemy was at the gates. It was over. President Hérolde de Seychelles managed to calm things down long enough for civil discussion to take place. Another Girondin now stepped in and proposed a compromise. If the Girondins' leaders resigned their functions, maybe that would be enough to sate the insurrectionary commune. This compromise, however, did not sit well with Langevin and his fellows. Most felt that they could not, in good conscience, betray their constituency by resigning without approval. And they were popular in their constituencies, so this proposal was blatantly anti-democratic. Only if the convention voted to have the leaders resign would they comply. Otherwise, the answer was no. The Girondins were defiant to the last. So the day's debates having accomplished exactly nothing, the Girondins called it quits and wanted to leave the theatre. A few abortive attempts later, and it became clear that they weren't going to get away that easily. Sans-Culotte had blocked the door, and outside awaited the National Guard. To make sure they were left unmolested, the Girondins induced the plane to join their walkout. As both factions began to file out, a few Jacobins were browbeaten into joining them. A few became several, and before long most of the Montagnards were out the door alongside the Girondins in the plane. This display of solidarity by the rival factions of the convention between the rival factions of the convention might well have worked had not François Hanriot been on watch. President Seychelles, leading the procession, bumped into Hanriot as the guard captain was mounted on horseback, sticking out like a flower in a field of grass. Seychelles asked why they had been blocked. "What do the people want?" he asked. A common Parisian, and not one to mince words, Hanriot answered in his typically brusque fashion. "Hérolde, they have not come to listen to idle talk." He made it plain that they were there to see the Girondins arrested. Alarmed, Seychelles ordered guardsmen to arrest Hanriot. None of them moved so much as an inch. Hanriot's orders, by comparison, were followed to the letter. On his command, gunners manned the artillery and took aim at the convention. Marat, present for this entire showdown, strutted right up to Seychelles, brimming with confidence. He recommended that the convention heed Hanriot's obvious warning and head back inside. And with no avenue of escape, bracketed by guardsmen, mercilessly insulted by the crowd, Seychelles saw no alternative. Together he and the convention slinked back into the theatre. Dejected and clearly in a state of shock, the president put up no resistance as the Montagnards put forth a proposal to vote on whether or not to have the Girondins arrested. This roused the Girondins, and they put up a good show, pleading their case. But it mattered little. When the time came to vote, the entire Girondin faction recused themselves from voting. The outcome, if it was ever in doubt, surprised no one. All 22 of the Girondin leaders were arrested. 5 other Girondins were also arrested. One by one, their names were read aloud by Marat before they were led from the theatre. The Journées had proven to be resounding successes. Further proof, as if it was needed, that the Sans-Culottes were the power behind the convention. They held the power of life and death for any national government based out of Paris. With the Girondins dead, soon to be buried, the Montagnards took centre stage. The National Convention was theirs. They'd won. They now controlled the Republic, but they also inherited a laundry list of problems. A losing war, regional revolts, the Vendée crisis. And now, most immediately, the threat of overthrow by the Sans-Culottes and the Enragés. Balancing the demands of the people against the necessities of war would be a tightrope the Montagnards would have to walk if they expected this republic to survive.